Hi there, I'm reading Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig, and this is chapter 24. Does Lila have quality? The question seemed inexhaustible. The answer Phaedrus had thought of before, biologically she does, socially she doesn't, still didn't get all the way to the bottom of it. There was more than society and biology involved. Phaedrus heard some voices in the corridor become louder and closer, then fade away. What had happened since the end of the First World War was that the intellectual level had entered the picture and had taken over everything. It was this intellectual level that was screwing everything up. The question of whether promiscuity is moral had been resolved from prehistoric times to the end of the Victorian era. But suddenly everything was upended by this new intellectual supremacy that said sexual promiscuity is neither moral nor immoral. It is just amoral human behavior. That might have been why Rigel was so angry back in Kingston. He thought Lila was immoral because she'd broken up a family and destroyed a man's position in the social community. A biological pattern of quality, sex, had destroyed a social pattern of quality, a family, and a job. What made Rigel mad was that into this scene come intellectuals like Phaedrus, who say it's unintelligent to repress biological drives. You must decide these matters on the basis of reason, not on the basis of social codes. But if Rigel identified Phaedrus with this intellectual versus society code and the social upheavals it has produced, he certainly picked on the wrong person. The metaphysics of quality uproots the intellectual source of this confusion, the doctrine that says science is not concerned with values. Science is concerned with only facts. In a subject-object metaphysics, this platitude is unassailable. But the metaphysics of quality asks, which values is science unconcerned with? Gravitation is an inorganic pattern of values. Is science unconcerned? Truth is an intellectual pattern of values. Is science unconcerned? A scientist may argue rationally that the moral question, is it all right to murder your neighbor, is not a scientific question. But can he argue that the moral question, is it all right to fake your scientific data, is not a scientific question? Can he say, as a scientist, the faking of scientific data is no concern to science? If he gets tricky and tries to say that it is a moral question about science, which is not part of science, then he has committed schizophrenia. He is admitting the existence of a real world that science cannot comprehend. What the metaphysics of quality makes clear is that it is only social values and morals, particularly church values and morals, that science is unconcerned with. There are important historic reasons for this. The doctrine of scientific disconnection from social morals goes all the way back to the ancient Greek belief that thought is independent of society, that it stands alone, born without parents. Ancient Greeks such as Socrates and Pythagoras paved the way for the fundamental principle behind science, that truth stands independently of social opinion. It has to be determined by direct observation and experiment, not by hearsay. Religious authority always has attacked this principle as heresy. For its early believers, the idea of a science independent of society was a very dangerous notion to hold. People died for it. The defenders who fought to protect science from church control argued that science is not concerned with morals. Intellectuals would leave morals for the church to decide. But what the larger intellectual structure of the metaphysics of quality makes clear is that this political battle of science to free itself from the domination by social moral codes was in fact a moral battle. It was the battle of a higher intellectual level of evolution to keep itself from being devoured by a lower social level of evolution. Once this political battle is resolved, the metaphysics of quality can go back and re-ask the question, just exactly how independent is science, in fact, from society? The answer it gives is not at all. A science in which social patterns of no account is as unreal and absurd as a society in which biological patterns are of no account. It's an impossibility. If society enters nowhere into the business of scientific discovery, then where does a scientific hypothesis come from? If the observer is totally objective and records only what he observes, then where does he observe a hypothesis? Atoms don't carry hypotheses about themselves around as part of their luggage. As long as you assume an exclusive subject-to-object, mind-matter science, that whole question is an inescapable intellectual black hole. Our scientific description of nature is always culturally derived. Nature tells us only what our culture predisposes us to hear. The selection of which inorganic patterns to observe and which to ignore is made on the basis of social patterns of value, or when it is not, on the basis of biological patterns of value. Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" was the historically shattering declaration of independence of the intellectual level of evolution from the social level of evolution. But would he have said it had he been a 17th century Chinese philosopher? If he had been, would anyone in 17th century China have listened to him and called him a brilliant thinker and recorded his name in history? If Descartes had said, "The 17th century French culture exists, therefore I think, therefore I am," he would have been correct. The metaphysics of quality resolves the relationship between intellect and society, subject and object, mind and matter, by embedding all of them in a larger system of understanding. Objects are inorganic and biological values. Subjects are social and intellectual values. They are not two mysterious universes that go floating around in some subject-object dream that allows them no real contact with one another. They have a matter-of-fact evolutionary relationship. That evolutionary relationship is also a moral one. Within this evolutionary relationship, it is possible to see that intellect has functions that predate science and philosophy. The intellect's evolutionary purpose has never been to discover an ultimate meaning of the universe. That is a relatively recent fad. Its historical purpose has been to help a society find food, detect danger, and defeat enemies. It can do this well or poorly, depending on the concepts it invents for this purpose. The cells dynamically invented animals to preserve and improve their situation. The animals dynamically invented societies, and societies dynamically invented intellectual knowledge for the same reasons. Therefore, to the question, what is the purpose of all this intellectual knowledge, the metaphysics of quality answers, the fundamental purpose of knowledge is to dynamically improve and preserve society. Knowledge has grown away from this historic purpose and has become an end in itself, just as society has grown away from its original purpose of preserving physical human beings and become an end to itself. And this growing away from original purposes towards greater quality is a moral growth. But those original purposes are still there, and when things get lost and go adrift, it is useful to remember that part of departure. The metaphysics of quality suggests that the social chaos of the 20th century can be relieved by going back to this point of departure and re-evaluating the path taken from it. It says it is immoral for intellect to be dominated by society for the same reasons it is immoral for children to be dominated by their parents. But that doesn't mean that children should assassinate their parents, and that doesn't mean intellectuals should assassinate society. Intellect can support static patterns of society without fear of domination by carefully distinguishing those moral issues that are social biological from those that are intellectual social, and making sure there is no encroachment either way. What's at issue here isn't just a clash of society and biology, but a clash of two entirely different codes of morals, in which society is in the middle term. You have a society versus biology code of morals, and you have an intellect versus society code of morals. It wasn't Lila Rigel was attacking. It was this intellect versus society code of morals. In the battle of society against biology, the new 20th century intellectuals have taken biology's side. Society can handle biology alone, by means of prisons and guns and police and the military. But when the intellectuals in control of society take biology's side against society, then society is caught in a crossfire from which it has no protection. The metaphysics of quality says there are not just two codes of morals, there are actually 5. Inorganic chaotic, biological inorganic, social biological, intellectual social, and dynamic static. This last, the dynamic static code, says what's good in life isn't defined by society or intellect or biology. What's good is freedom from domination by any static pattern, but that freedom doesn't have to be obtained by the destruction of the patterns themselves. Rigel's interpretation of recent moral history is probably a pretty simple one. Old codes versus new chaos. But a metaphysics of quality says it's not at all that simple. An analysis of separate moral systems sees the history of the 20th century in an entirely different way. Until the First World War, the Victorian social codes dominated. From the First World War until the Second World War, the intellectuals dominated unchallenged. From the Second World War until the 70s, the intellectuals continued to dominate, but with an increasing challenge. Call it the hippie revolution, which failed. And from the early 70s, there's been a slow, confused, mindless drift back to a kind of pseudo-Victorian moral posture, accompanied by an unprecedented and unexplained growth in crime. Of these periods, the last two seem the most misunderstood. The hippies have been interpreted as frivolous, spoiled children, and the period following their departure as a return to values, whatever that means. The Metaphysics of Quality, however, says that's backward. The hippie revolution was a moral movement. The present period is the collapse of values. The hippie revolution of the 80s was a moral revolution against both society and intellectuality. It was a whole new social phenomenon no intellectual had predicted and no intellectuals were able to explain. It was a revolution by the children of well-to-do, college-educated, modern people of the world who suddenly turned upon their parents and their schools and their society with a hatred no one could have believed existed. This was not any new paradise of the intellectuals of the 20th century. This was not any new paradise the intellectuals of the 20th century were trying to achieve by freedom from Victorian restraints. This was something else that had blown up in their faces. Friedrich thought the reason this movement has been so hard to understand is that the understanding itself, static intellect, was the enemy. The culture-bearing book of the period, On the Road by Jack Kerouac, was a running lecture against intellect. All my New York friends were in the negative nightmare position of putting down society and giving their tired bookish or political or psychoanalytic reasons, Kerouac wrote. But the dean, the hero of the book, just raced in society, eager for bread and love. He didn't care one way or the other. In the 20s, it had been thought that society was the cause of man's unhappiness and that intellect would cure it. But in the 60s, it was thought that both society and intellect together were the cause of all the unhappiness, and that transcendence of both society and intellect would cure it. Whatever the intellectuals of the 20s had fought to create, the flower children of the 60s fought to destroy. Contempt for rules, for material possessions, for war, for police, for science, for technology were standard repertoire. The blowing of the mind was important. Drugs that destroyed one's ability to reason were almost a sacrament. Oriental religions such as Zen and Vedanta that promised release from the prison of intellect were taken up as a gospel. The cultural values of blacks and Indians, to the extent that they were anti-intellectual, were mimicked. Anarchy became the most popular politics, and squalor and poverty and chaos became the most popular lifestyles. Degeneracy was practiced for degeneracy's sake. Anything was good that shook off the paralyzing intellectual grip of the social intellectual establishment. By the end of the 60s, the intellectualism of the 20s found itself in an impossible trap. If it continued to advocate more freedom from Victorian social restraint, all it would get was more hippies, who were really just carrying its anti-Victorianism to an extreme. If, on the other hand, it advocated more constructive social conformity in opposition to the hippies, all it would get was more Victorians, in the form of the reactionary right. The political whipsaw was invincible, and in 1968, it cut down one of the last great intellectual liberal leaders of the New Deal period, Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate for president. "I've seen enough of this," Humphrey exclaimed at the disastrous 1968 Democratic Convention. "I've seen far too much of it." But he had no explanation for it and no remedy, and neither did anyone else. The great intellectual revolution of the first half of the 20th century, the dream of a great society made humane by man's intellect, was killed, hoisted on its own petard of freedom from social restraint. Friedrich thought that this hippie revolution could have been almost as much an advance over the intellectual 20s as the 20s had been over the social 1890s, but his analysis showed that this dynamic 60s revolution made a disastrous mistake that destroyed it before it really got started. The hippie rejection of social and intellectual patterns left just two directions to go, toward biological quality and toward dynamic quality. The revolutionaries of the 60s thought that since both are antisocial and since both are anti-intellectual, Why then they must both be the same. That was the mistake. American writing on Zen during this period showed this confusion. Zen was often thought to be a sort of innocent anything goes. If you did anything you pleased, without regard for social restraint, at the exact moment you pleased to do it, that would express your Buddha nature. To the Japanese Zen masters coming to this country, this must have seemed really strange. Japanese Zen is attached to social disciplines so meticulous, they make the Puritans look almost degenerate. Back in the 50s and 60s, Friedrich had shared this confusion of biological quality and dynamic quality, but the metaphysics of quality seemed to help clear it up. When biological quality and dynamic quality are confused, the result isn't an increase in dynamic quality. It's an extremely destructive form of degeneracy of the sort seen in the Manson murders, the Jonestown madness, and the increase of crime and drug addiction throughout the country. In the early 70s, as people began to see this, they dropped away from the movement, and the hippie revolution, like the intellectual revolution of the 20s, became a moral rebellion that failed. Today, it seemed to Friedrich, the overall picture is one of moral movements gone bankrupt. Just as the intellectual revolution undermined social patterns, the hippies undermined both static and intellectual patterns. Nothing better has been introduced to replace them. The result has been a drop in both social and intellectual quality. In the United States, the national intelligence level shown in SAT scores has gone down. Organized crime has grown more powerful and more sinister. Urban ghettos have grown larger and more dangerous. The end of the 20th century in America seems to be an intellectual, social, and economic rust belt, a whole society that has given up on dynamic improvement and is slowly trying to slip back to Victorianism, the last static ratchet latch. More dynamic foreign cultures are overtaking it and actually invading it because it's now incapable of competing. What's coming out of the urban slums, where old Victorian social moral codes are almost completely destroyed, isn't any paradise the revolutionaries hoped for, but a reversion to rule by terror, violence, and gang death, the old biological might makes right morality of prehistoric brigandage that primitive societies were set up to overcome. Friedrich looked at the glass window across the hotel room and at the darkness beyond it. The question that seemed to grow in his mind every time he came back to New York was, is this city going to survive or isn't it? It always had social problems, and it's always survived them. And somehow it's always been strengthened by them, and maybe that will happen again. But this time the odds didn't look bright. He remembered the title Rudyard Kipling had used for Calcutta back in Victorian times, the city of dreadful night. That's what this city was becoming. It was the most dynamic place on earth, but the price of being dynamic is instability. Any dynamic situation is vulnerable to attrition and corruption, and even to complete collapse. When you take steps forward into the unknown, you always risk being smashed by that unknown. There had always been a battle between intense legions of the most dynamic and most moral on one side, confronting the most biological and least moral on the other. Between A-class people and F-class people. The B's and C's were out in other boroughs and suburbs doing static things. But now, here, the F's seemed to be winning. From the hotel window looking out across the park, it seemed as if you could see from the north, from the ghetto areas there, a dreadful night. An eclipse of social patterns by invading unchecked biological patterns, closing in and gradually putting New York into a sleep from which it might never recover. It isn't a war of races or of cultures. It's a war of society against patterns of reason and patterns of biology that have been set loose by the mistakes of this century. The most sinister thing about the fall of the Roman Empire was that the people who conquered it never understood that they had done so. They paralyzed the patterns of Roman social structure to a point where everybody just forgot what the structure was. Taxes became uncollectible. Armies composed of hired barbarians stopped receiving pay. Everything just lapsed. The patterns of civilization were forgotten, and a dark age settled in. Friedrich wasn't sure, but he seemed to detect a peculiar gentleness here on the streets, now that he didn't remember from the past. It was an ominous gentleness found in old and corrupt cultures, the gentleness one hears in Neapolitan street songs and in old Mexican canciones. It comes not from an absence of violence, but from an excess of it. Live and let live, avoid trouble. It was the gentleness of someone who has given up fighting openly because it is too dangerous to do so. He had the sickening feeling that something like the fall of the Roman Empire was beginning to happen here. What was so sinister now about New York was that the patterns that built it no longer seemed understood. Those who understood the patterns are no longer in control of those who don't. What seemed to allow this deadly night to descend was the intellectual patterns that were supposed to be in charge of things, that should comprehend the threat and lead the fight against it, were paralyzed. They were paralyzed not by any external force, but by their own internal construction, which made them unable to comprehend what was happening. It was like watching the spider waiting while the wasp gets ready to attack it. The spider can leave any time to save its life, but it doesn't do so. It just waits there, paralyzed by some internal pattern of responses that make it unable to recognize its own danger. The wasp plants its eggs in the spider's body, and the spider lives on, while the wasp larvae slowly eat it and destroy it. Phaedrus thought that a metaphysics of quality could be a replacement for the paralyzing intellectual system that is allowing all this destruction to go unchecked. The paralysis of America is a paralysis of moral patterns. Morals can't function normally because morals have been declared intellectually illegal by the subject-object metaphysics that dominates present social thought. These subject-object patterns were never designed for the job of governing society. They're not doing it. When they're put in the position of controlling society, of setting moral standards and declaring values, and when they declare that there are no values and no morals, the result isn't progress, the result is social catastrophe. It's this intellectual pattern of amoral objectivity that is to blame for the social deterioration of America, because it has undermined the static social values necessary to prevent deterioration. In its condemnation of social repression as the enemy of liberty, it has never come forth with a single moral principle that distinguishes a Galileo fighting social repression from a common criminal fighting social repression. It has, as a result, been the champion of both. That's the root of the problem. Phaedrus remembered parties in the 50s and 60s full of liberal intellectuals like himself, who actually admired the criminal types that sometimes showed up. Here we are, they seemed to believe, drug pushers, flower children, anarchists, civil rights workers, college professors. We're all just comrades in arms against the cruel and corrupt social system that is really the enemy of us all. No one liked the cops at these parties. Anything that restricted the police was good. Why? Well, because the police are never intellectual about anything. They're just stooges for the social system. They revere the social system and hate intellectuals. It was sort of a caste thing. The police were low caste. Intellectuals were above all that crime and violence sort of thing that the police were constantly engaged in. Police were usually not very well educated either. The best thing you could do was take away their guns. That way they'd be like the police in England, where things were better. It was the police repression that created the crime. What passed for morality within this crowd was a kind of vague, amorphous soup of sentiments known as human rights. You were supposed to be reasonable. What these terms really meant was never spelled out in any way that Phaedrus had ever heard. You were just supposed to cheer for them. He knew now that the reason nobody ever spelled them out was because nobody ever could. In a subject-object understanding of the world, these terms have no meaning. There's no such thing as human rights. There is no such thing as moral reasonableness. There are subjects and objects and nothing else. This soup of sentiments about logically non-existent entities can be straightened out by the metaphysics of quality. It says that what is meant by human rights is usually the moral code of intellect versus society, the moral right of intellect to be free of social control, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, of travel, trial by jury, habeas corpus, government by consent. These human rights are all intellect versus society issues. According to the metaphysics of quality, these human rights have not just a sentimental basis, but a rational metaphysical basis. They are essential to the evolution of a higher level of life from a lower level of life. They are for real. But what the metaphysics of quality also makes clear is that this intellect versus society code of morals is not all the same as the society versus biology code of morals that go back to a prehistoric time. They're completely separate levels of morals. They should never be confused. The central term of confusion between these two levels of codes is society. Is society good or is society evil? The question is confused because the term society is common to both these levels, but in one level society is a higher evolutionary pattern and in the other it's a lower. Unless you separate these two levels of moral codes, you get a paralyzing confusion as to whether society is moral or immoral. That paralyzing confusion is what dominates all thoughts about morality and society today. The idea that man is born free but everywhere in chains was never true. There are no chains more vicious than the chains of biological necessity into which every child is born. Society exists primarily to free people from these biological chains. It has done that job so stunningly well, intellectuals forget the fact and turn upon society with a shameful ingratitude for what society has done. Today we are living in an intellectual and technological paradise and a moral and social nightmare because the intellectual level of evolution, in its struggle to become free of the social level, has ignored the social level's role in keeping the biological level under control. Intellectuals have failed to understand the ocean of biological quality that is constantly being suppressed by social order. Biological quality is necessary to the survival of life, but when it threatens to dominate and destroy society, biological quality becomes the evil itself, the great Satan of 20th century Western culture. One reason why fundamentalist Muslim cultures have become so fanatic in their hatred of the West is that it has released the biological forces of evil that Islam has fought for centuries to control. What the metaphysics of quality indicates is that the 20th century intellectual faith in man's basic goodness as spontaneous and natural is disastrously naive. The ideal of a harmonious society in which everyone without coercion cooperates happily with everyone else for the mutual good of all is a devastating fiction. It isn't consistent with scientific fact. Studies of bones left by cavemen indicate that cannibalism, not cooperation, was a pre-society norm. Primitive tribes such as the American Indians have no record of sweetness and cooperation with other tribes. They ambushed them, tortured them, dashed their children's brains out on the rocks. If man is basically good, then maybe it is man's basic goodness which invented social institutions to repress this kind of biological savagery in the first place. Suddenly we have come full circle at the American culture's founders, the Puritans, and their overwhelming concern with original sin and release from it. The mythology by which they explained this original sin seems no longer useful in a scientific world, but when we look at the things in their contemporary society they identified with this original sin, we see something remarkable. Drinking, dancing, sex, playing the fiddle, gambling, idleness, these are biological pleasures. Early Puritan morals were largely a suppression of biological quality. In the metaphysics of quality, the old Puritan dogma is gone, but its practical moral pronouncements are explained in a way that makes sense. The Victorians didn't really believe in those old Puritan biological restraints the way the Puritans did. They were in the process of breaking away from them, but they paid them lip service, and the old spare the rod and spoil the child school of biological repression was still in fashion. And what one notices when one reads the works of the children of those traditions is how much more decent and socially mature they seemed than people do today. The 1920s intellectuals strove to break down the old social codes, but they had these codes built into them from childhood, so they were unaffected by the breakdown they produced, but their descendants, raised without the codes, have suffered. What the metaphysics of quality concludes is that the old Puritan and Victorian social codes should not be followed blindly, but should not be attacked blindly either. They should be dusted off and re-examined, fairly and impartially, to see what they were trying to accomplish and what they actually did accomplish toward building a stronger society. We must understand that when a society undermines intellectual freedom for its own purposes, it is absolutely morally bad. But when it represses biological freedom for its own purposes, it is absolutely morally good. These moral bads and goods are not just customs. They are as real as rocks and trees. The destructive sympathy by intellectuals toward lawlessness in the 60s and since is derived, no doubt, from what is perceived to be a common enemy of the social system. But the metaphysics of quality concludes that this sympathy is really stupid. The decades since the 60s have borne this out. Fiedrus remembered a conversation in the early 60s with a University of Chicago faculty member who was moving out of the Woodlawn neighborhood next to the university. He was moving because criminal blacks had moved in, and it had become too dangerous to live there. Fiedrus had said he didn't think moving out was any solution. The professor had blown up at him. "What you don't know," he had said, "we tried everything. We've tried workshops, study groups, councils. We've spent years on this. If there's anything we've missed, we don't know what it is. Everything has failed." The professor added, "You don't understand what a defeat this has been for us. It is as though we never even tried." Fiedrus had no answer at the time, but he had one now. The idea that biological crimes can be ended by intellect alone, that you can talk crime to death, doesn't work. Intellectual patterns cannot directly control biological patterns. Only social patterns can control biological patterns. And the instrument of conversation between society and biology is not words. The instrument of conversation between society and biology has always been a policeman or a soldier and his gun. All the laws of history, all the arguments, all the constitutions and the bills of rights and the declarations of independence are nothing more than instructions to the military and police. If the military and police can't or don't follow these instructions properly, they might as well have never been written. Fiedrus now thought that part of the professor's paralysis was a commitment to the 20th century intellectual doctrines, in which his university had had a prominent role. A second part of the paralysis probably came from the fact that the criminals were black. If it had been a group of trash whites moving into the neighborhood, robbing and raping and killing, the response would have been much fiercer. But when whites denounced blacks for robbing and raping and killing, they left themselves open to the charge of racism. In the atmosphere of public opinion of that time, no intellectual dared to open himself up to the charge of being a racist. Just the thought of it shut him up tight. Paralysis. That charge is part of the paralysis of this city here, right now. The root of the racism charge goes all the way back to square one, to the subject-object metaphysics wherein man is an object who possesses a set of properties called a culture. The subject-object metaphysics lumps biological man and cultural man together as aspects of a single molecular unit. It goes on to reason that because it is immoral to speak against a people because of their genetic characteristics, it is therefore immoral to speak against a people because of their cultural characteristics. The anthropological doctrine of cultural relativism reinforces this. It says you cannot judge one culture in terms of the values of another. Science says there is no morality outside of cultural morality. Therefore, any moral censorship of minority patterns of crime in this city is itself immoral. That is the paralysis. By contrast, the metaphysics of quality, also going back to square one, says that man is composed of static levels of patterns of evolution, with a capability of response to dynamic quality. It says that biological patterns and cultural patterns are often grouped together, but to say that a cultural pattern is an integral part of a biological person is like saying the Lotus 123 program is an integral part of an IBM computer. Not so. Cultures are not the source of all morals, only a limited set of morals. Cultures can be graded and judged morally according to their contribution to the evolution of life. A culture that supports the dominance of social values over biological values is an absolutely superior culture to one that does not, and a culture that supports the dominance of intellectual values over social values is absolutely superior to one that does not. It is immoral to speak against a people because of the color of their skin, or any other genetic characteristic, because these are not changeable, and it doesn't matter anyway. But it is not immoral to speak against a person because of his cultural characteristics if those cultural characteristics are immoral? These are changeable and do matter. Blacks have no right to violate social codes and call it racism when someone tries to stop them, if those codes are not racist codes. That is slander. The fight to sustain social codes isn't a war of blacks versus whites, or Hispanics versus blacks, or poor people versus rich people, or even stupid people against intelligent people, or any other of all the other possible cultural confrontations. It's a war of biology versus society. It's a war of biological blacks and biological whites against social blacks and social whites. Genetic patterns just confuse the matter, and this is a war in which intellect, to end the paralysis of society, has to know which side it is on and support that side, never undercut it. Where biological values are undermining social values, intellectuals must identify social behavior, no matter what its ethnic connection, and support it all the way without restraint. Intellectuals must find biological behavior, no matter what its ethnic connection, and limit or destroy destructive biological patterns with complete moral ruthlessness, the way a doctor destroys germs, before those biological patterns destroy civilization itself. This city of dreadful night, what a disaster. Phaedrus wondered what was going to happen to Lila, just shifting around here from one scene to another. She'd been around long enough to know how to take care of herself, he supposed, but it still spooked him. He was sorry to see her go like that. He got up, went to the bedroom, and looked at the bed, wondering whether he should go to sleep now. He decided to take a shower instead. It would be the last one for a while. There really wasn't much purpose in being up here in this hotel room, he thought. His business with Redford was all done. He really should be back down there on the river watching after things. He checked the boat lines yesterday, but you never know. Some tug could throw a wake in there and really mess things up. Lila had said she would just go down and take her suitcase off. But under the circumstances, with her mad at him like that, it was probably something he should check into, particularly in this city, in this dreadful night. By the time he was done showering, he had decided to pack and get back and sleep on the boat. He dressed and packed his duffel bag and got ready to go. Then, with his tote full of unread mail over one arm and his duffel bag balancing it in the other hand, he passed through the sitting room toward the door. There he noticed that the moth was still buzzing under the lampshade, still engaged with its own personal war with the forces of darkness. He took one last look at the magic balcony window on the other side of the room, and then closed the door on it forever. In the hallway, waiting for the elevator, he listened to the howling, windy sounds of the elevator shaft. Howling wind sounds. They have a meaning for boat people that others seldom understand. Suddenly it came to him that the moth didn't struggle to get up here at all. The moth rode up here on the elevator like everybody else. That was a 20th century moth. Only Victorian moths struggle against the darkness. He smiled a little at that.